Welcome to Inside Azure AI Foundry, where we put the latest models and tools to the test. I'm April, your host for this episode, and today we're diving into a new API that supports language translation. It's the Azure AI Translator API, and it's currently in public preview. The Azure AI Translator API provides the flexibility to choose either neural machine translation or a large language model for translation. Not only does the API support translation, but it's equipped with some great additional features such as tone translation, gender translation, and adaptive custom translation. And today, we're going to take a look at a few examples of where this API could come in handy. When I first heard about this API, my mind immediately went to how this API could help support a customer service function of a retailer, especially if that customer service support function is chat-based. So let's assume that our human customer support agent speaks English, and then the customer that's reaching out, they only speak French. Let's dive in. Okay, we're going to kick things off in the Azure portal. What we'll need to do is create an Azure AI Foundry resource. Alternatively, you could create an Azure AI Translator resource. However, you won't be able to leverage the new capabilities that I mentioned, nor will you be able to do translations with a large language model. So to begin with creating an Azure AI Foundry resource, within Azure Services, you'll select Azure AI Foundry. Within here, there will be a button for create a resource. And now from here, you'll need to select your subscription, the resource group, provide a name, as well as a region. Once you have that entered, you can also provide a default project name as well. I'm going to leave mine as first project, which is a default, and then you'll select next. Then from here, you'll continue to select every option that's right for what you're creating. I'm going to leave mine as the selected option. I'm going to also continue, clicking next, and now we're finally at review and submit. After it does the validation, you can then select create. The deployment will go ahead and start, and then once the deployment is done, you will have the ability to go directly to that resource. So now my resource is complete, and I can go ahead and select go to resource. And then this takes me directly to that resource that was created. Within the resource itself, you'll also need to ensure that you have the right permissions set. I'm going to link in the comments where you can go and find more information about setting those permissions, but as a heads up, it'll be within the access control section. Now there's two important pieces of information that you're going to need in this resource, and that's going to be the subscription key as well as the region itself. To find that, you can go to Resource Management on the left-hand side and select Keys and Endpoint. And then in here, you're going to be able to copy either Key 1 or Key 2, you only need one of them, and then also the location/region. And in my case, that's going to be East US 2. Make sure you know where to access this, because when we head over into Visual Studio Code, that's when you're going to need these pieces of information. So now that we have the resource created, I'm going to go back to the overview page here. And what we now need to do is an actual large language model deployment. Because if you recall, not only can we do the neural machine translation, we can also do a large language model translation. But in order to do that, we need an actual model deployment. So from here, we can select go to Azure AI Foundry portal, and that is where we can go and deploy either GPT-4o or 4o mini. So here within Foundry, I'm going to go to Model Catalog. And then within the Model Catalog, I'm going to scroll down and I'll search for GPT-4o. Again, you can either use 4o or 4o mini. Those are the only two supported models at this time. GPT-4o is the first choice here. So after selecting that, I'm going to use this model so we can start the deployment itself. You'll give the deployment a name. I recommend keeping it easily identifiable, likely the name of the model itself, which in this case is GPT-4o, because you will need that name later when we're in VS Code. And then my deployment type is going to be global standard, but you can select whichever makes most sense for you. You can also adjust the capacity if necessary. You would select customize and then that'll open up this section, but I'm going to leave everything as is. And then from here, I'll select deploy. And now from here, I'm at the model deployment page itself, and this is where I have more information about the model. I actually won't need to leverage any of the information here for what we're going to do in this demo. But if you ever need to come find this information for the model for anything else that you're creating, this is where you can come and find the key for the model. You have the endpoint for the model deployment as well. Here in Visual Studio Code, we'll start off with the neural machine translation example. I'll take you through this setup and I'll call out anything that might be helpful for you if you're giving this a try on your own. So to start things off, I'm loading my environment variables. I do have a .env file created, and that consists of my subscription key as well as the region. Once I have those loaded, I then can define the headers. And so within the headers, I have the subscription key and the region itself. And if you aren't sure where to grab those, as a reminder, they're going to be here within the resource that was created earlier, that Azure AI Foundry resource. You'll just need one of the two keys as well as the region. And then we have the body itself. So the body is going to consist of the text that's actually going to be translated, followed by the language from which the text will be translated from. And then in the targets area, we're going to have the language that we're translating to. And then just below the response, the only thing that I'm actually going to return in this case is going to be the translated text. However, you can return the full JSON response if that's what you prefer, but I just need the text here. And then we get to the actual text that we're going to send in for translation. So as a reminder, I have an English-speaking customer service agent who's communicating with a French-speaking customer. And this French-speaking customer would have submitted this text to be translated. And what we want to do is translate that text, which says, "J'ai un problème avec ma commande," from French into English. And so the text itself we defined, and then you need the language code for the from language, which in this case is going to be FR for French, and then the to language, which is going to be EN for English. And then we'll go ahead and print that. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a terminal, and we can go ahead and run this. I'll make this just a little bigger for you all. All right. And just like that, we have our response. The text that we translated says, "I have a problem with my order." Now let's give this a try using large language model instead to do the translation. So the setup is going to be very similar. There is a slight difference in terms of what we're going to define in the body itself. So here within the body, I now have another target, which is going to be the deployment name. So the deployment name needs to be defined as the model deployment itself. And just in case you forgot where to find that, that's going to be here within the Azure AI Foundry portal for the model that you deployed earlier. So I'm using GPT-4o. Again, alternatively, you could use GPT-4o Mini. Those are the only two supported models at this time. And then everything else stays the same here. I'm using that same line of text from before, that same string. We're still doing the translation from French to English. But within translated text, there's one key difference here, which is now adding in the model deployment name. And in my case, it's going to be GPT-4o. I'm going to open up the terminal so you can see what that looks like now when we run that. And here I have an issue with my order. And so you'll notice that we have slight difference in how things were translated. if I go back to the option for the neural machine translation, the translation itself was I have a problem with my order, most likely stemming from the problem. Whereas with the large language model translation, instead it says I have an issue, whereas problem has been loosely translated to an issue. So you may be wondering, when would you choose neural machine translation over large language model translation and vice versa? Well, neural machine translation is purpose-built to do translations, and it's optimized to specifically maximize translation accuracy and fluency, whereas large language model translation is, well, it's a part of the task that large language models can perform. Large language models can translate, and in addition to that, they can code, they can summarize, they can reason, plus many more things. So if you are going to do translation plus something such as contextual understanding or instruction following, for example, or cultural adaptation, then consider using a large language model for a translation. Also, not to mention, if tone and creativity or even nuanced phrasing is going to be higher prioritized over exact precision for word translation, then it's likely that a large language model is going to be ideal for language translation. All right, so let's say from here, our human English-speaking customer support agent wants to respond back to our French-speaking customer. So what we need to consider here is the tone in which that translation would occur. So similar setup from before, not much has changed, but one difference is now we've introduced tone in the body itself. And that's going to be either a formal tone, an informal tone, or a neutral tone. And I've also added that down below within the translated text or the translate text. And so at the very end, I'm going to try out with formal first, and we'll swap that out for informal just so we can see how different the translations are. We're still going to be using a large language model to do the translations, given what I just shared. And what we're going to translate is the phrase, "Can you send me the details?" So I'm going to go ahead and open up this terminal. And let's run this to see a more formal way of translating this. Okay, let's test my French. Pouvez-vous m'envoyer les détails? So this would be a formal translation. But let's say we want this to now be informal. Let's see what this one says. All right, so we do have a difference here. Now, an informal version would be "Peux-tu m'envoyer les détails?" I so hope I pronounced that correctly. But as we can see here, we have two very distinct ways of translating this phrase, "Can you send me the details?" And you might be wondering, well, why would someone want to use an informal translation versus a formal translation? Well, let's say the customer support agent is engaging with someone via chat through direct message on social media, for example. It's a very common thing that you see brands doing these days is engaging with customers on social media. And so let's say when they're engaging on social, their identity is more casual. And so therefore the informal version would be ideal. Whereas if they're speaking with someone coming directly to the brand's website, for example, and they want to have more of a formal tone, more professional tone, then they would potentially use formal in that case. Of course, you can always do neutral as well. Curious to see what that says, given LLM's non-deterministic nature. I'm not quite sure what we're going to get, but let's just test it to say we tested things. All right, so it turns out the neutral and the formal way of translation is going to be that first option from before, which was "Pouvez-vous m'envoyer les détails?" So yeah, all right, let's try another example. So the French language is a gender marking language. And what this means is that nouns and modifiers, they agree in gender. And so what we can do with this API is also include gender in the translation itself. Setup is going to be very similar, as you can see here on the screen. As I scroll down here, we're going to have a new target added for gender itself, and that's going to be the translation gender. It can either be male, female, or neutral. Everything else here stays the same, but as I scroll down, I have a new line of text that we have, and let's say in this example, we want to let our French-speaking customer know that their case has been forwarded to the support supervisor, April Gittens, and she will contact you today to review the situation. We're going from English to French. We're still using a large language model for translation, and now we've indicated the gender that we're going to use for the translation, which in this case is going to be female. Why is this important? Well, in French, when we say the support supervisor, we need to ensure that support supervisor in this case is not going to be gender neutral. It needs to reflect a female in this case. However, this is going to be purely based off of personal preference, and this is purely for the sake of an example for you all. And in this case, I want to identify that support supervisor is female. Likewise, if this was male, I would switch the gender at the end to male instead. So let's go ahead and give this a try in the terminal. Okay, so here's what we have back. Votre dossier a été transmis à la superviseure du support, April Gittens. Elle vous contactera aujourd'hui pour examiner la situation. Y'all, I'm trying my best with the French. But in this translation, what's important to call out here is the la superviseure du support. That is the female translation for supervisor. Now, if I were to switch this out instead to male and do this translation, this now says something completely different. The la supervision du support is different. It now has au supervision du support. And what's a key difference here, if you know the French language, is that the ending for supervisor is now masculine. We also have au because we have this combined or this combination of a as well as le, and that has become au. So therefore, we now have the masculine or male translation of this sentence. So you can do so many different combinations when you're using this API to do translations. And so far I've been showing you how you can do a translation for just a string of text, but you can do different combinations of language translations. You can add gender plus also add tone, so you can start stacking on top of all the different targets that you want to add. This final example that I'm going to show you is an example of how you can actually go about doing that. So top portion, very similar to what you've seen so far. None of that should be new. But as I scroll down here, you may set this up completely different. In the example that I have here, this is how I'm setting it up. So in the body itself, I've defined the text. I've also defined the from language, and then I have this list of targets, or this dictionary of targets that I'm defining later on down in the script itself. So if I move on down here, what I can see is that my target language, my first option is going to be French. I want something translated from English in my case to French, and I want it to be a large language model translation. So we're going to be using GPT-4o. In addition to that, I also want to see a translation of the text that I'm going to provide or the string that I'm going to provide into Spanish. So now we have a new language code, and that's going to be ES for Spanish. So at this stage, looking down in my results, my translate text function that I have here that I'm calling is going to say, I have a problem with my order. It's that string that we use in the very first example. And the from language is going to be English. And the targets that we're going to add are the targets that I just went through. So let's go ahead and run that in the terminal so we can see what the output is. I formatted the output just a little different so we can see all of the output itself. And I'll make this bigger. All right, so this also gives you an idea of what the full JSON response looks like as well. And this is available in the documentation in case you're curious. But for the translation, we have for the very first one that the language is going to be French. We have 297 instruction tokens. We have 7 source tokens, 10 response tokens, 7 target tokens. And then we have the translation, which in this case is j'ai un problème avec mon commande. Whereas for Spanish, we have 30 source characters. We are using a neural machine translation in this case. We're not doing a large language model translation. And so the way that that got translated is tengo un problema con un pedido. This is how you can add multiple targets. You can stack them as well, but I just wanted to give you an example of how you would go about setting that up. So yeah. All right, that wraps up this episode of Inside Azure AI Foundry. Give translation a try with the Azure AI Translator API available via the Azure portal. And then head over to the Azure AI Foundry portal to deploy your GPT 4o and 4o mini models. I'll be back soon with another episode sharing the latest drops from Azure AI Foundry. But until then, come join me over in the Azure AI Foundry Discord where you can share what you're building, ask questions, and provide product feedback. I love to hear from you all. Well, until next time, I'll see you in another episode.